Hey guys, tonight we'll delve into the tumultuous and tragic story of Mary Tudor, whom history often remembers by the name Bloody Mary, but that is a name that doesn't fully reflect the fierce trials she had to endure. Let's take a look together at the destiny of this woman. Imagine a summer's day in the year 1553. Amidst the roaring cheers, a magnificent procession reached the capital. Mary returned, not just to reclaim the throne she had been stripped of, but also to carry out a religious mission that had caused her countless years of suffering and humiliation. Would this victory bring peace? Or would it merely be the beginning of a greater tragedy, where her steadfast faith pushed her into an uncompromising war with her own subjects? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as usual, please let me know where you're listening from and what the local time is where you are. Tonight, we will turn over every page of history to understand more about this tragic queen at the most peaceful rhythm. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. On a warm summer day in the year 1553, after 10 long days on the road, a magnificent procession reached the heart of London. At its head rode Mary Tudor, the eldest daughter of King Henry VIII, come to claim what she believed was hers by birth and by God's will, the crown of England. On the 3rd of August, 1553, she entered the city through Aldgate, moving slowly through streets hung with tapestries of silk and gold, while bells rang and crowds wept for joy. Witnesses said she smiled through her tears, raising her eyes to heaven and reciting the words of St. Paul, "If God be for us, who can be against us?" It was the sound of triumph after years of humiliation, exile and fear. Yet behind that glorious entry lay the shadow of a reign that would soon be consumed by fire and faith. For Mary, daughter of Henry and Catherine of Aragon, was a queen who ruled not by calculation, but by conscience. And that conscience, fierce and unbending, would drive her to send hundreds of her subjects to the flames, believing with all her soul that she was saving their souls. But to understand the woman who rode through London that day, one must begin far earlier in another century, another world, when her story first began. Mary Tudor was born on the 18th of February, 1516, at Greenwich Palace, the grand residence that overlooked the River Thames. Her birth was celebrated with all the joy that England could muster. After 7 barren years of marriage, Catherine of Aragon had at last delivered a living child. Bells rang across the city, feasts were held in every hall, and ships upon the river fired their guns in salute. In the soft light of the chapel, she was baptized before a golden font, named Mary, in honor of the Virgin, a name that would follow her like both a blessing and a curse. Mary was not merely another royal infant. She was the first surviving child of King Henry VIII and his Spanish queen, and therefore the heir to the Tudor line. Yet there was one immutable fact that dimmed the glow of celebration. Mary was a girl. In England, no woman had ever ruled alone. The crown, as custom decreed, was a man's inheritance. A daughter might wear a crown, yes, but only beside a husband, only as his shadow. So from the hour she was born, Mary's destiny was already written. She would be a bride, not a ruler. Still, her father adored her. Henry called her his pearl of the world, and he paraded her through court with pride. Her mother, Catherine, was equally devoted, perhaps more fiercely so. The Spanish queen had endured loss after loss. Stillbirths, infants who lived only hours, endless prayers unanswered. Mary was her miracle. Catherine saw in her the future not only of England, but of Spain's alliance and God's divine favour. She vowed that her daughter would be educated as if she were a prince. When Mary was scarcely 2 years old, her tiny hand was pledged in betrothal to the Dauphin of France, the heir to the French throne. The ceremony was a mimicry of marriage, complete with solemn vows and music diplomacy disguised as childhood play. It was the first of many such engagements, each one a link in the long chain of treaties that bound England to the shifting politics of Europe. For Mary, even in infancy, her worth was not her own. She was both daughter and symbol, pawn and promise. Yet if Henry gave her royal blood, Catherine gave her something even more enduring identity. Catherine of Aragon was the daughter of the great Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, whose armies had driven out the Moors and united Spain under the cross. Her lineage stretched across Europe, and her empire reached even into the newly discovered lands of America. From her mother, Mary inherited a proud sense of Spanish piety. Catherine insisted her daughter learn her mother's tongue as well as her father's. By the age of 10, Mary spoke Spanish as fluently as English and prayed in both. Life at court for a time was golden. Mary studied music, dance, and the lute. She played chess with her tutors and rode spirited horses through the royal parks. Her governesses reported her to be quick-witted and affectionate, though prone to melancholy when separated from her mother. Visitors from foreign courts described her as fair and red-haired, with eyes like her father's and the delicate grace of her mother. She loved music and laughter, but she was also serious beyond her years, a child already shaped by duty. Catherine's influence was constant. Determined that her daughter would never be dismissed as merely a woman, she personally taught Mary the foundations of Latin, a language then considered the domain of men, of priests, and of kings. In one surviving letter, written when Mary was 8 or 9, Catherine expressed satisfaction that her daughter's Latin lessons were progressing under a new tutor. The Queen wrote tenderly, yet firmly, that learning such a manly subject would fit her child for the highest offices of life. Those words, preserved across centuries, reveal a mother's strange foresight, for in time, Mary would indeed wield the power that had always been denied her sex. For the moment, though, she was only a child of promise, a small figure in silk, standing between two worlds. Her father's England and her mother's Spain, her royal birth and her woman's body, her laughter and her faith. She did not yet know that these halves would one day tear against each other, and that the very gifts her parents had given her, strength, piety, pride, would become the causes of her greatest suffering. And so, in the summer of 1553, when she entered London as queen, all of those years the Latin lessons, the foreign betrothals, the songs her mother had sung in Spanish seemed to converge into one radiant moment. The people saw only victory. But behind the music, behind the banners and the tears of joy, the child of Greenwich still carried the weight of two kingdoms in her heart, and that weight, in time, would break her. When Mary was about 8 or 9 years old, she received a gentle but firm letter from her mother. In it, Queen Catherine of Aragon instructed her daughter to change her Latin tutor. To any outsider, it was a trivial detail, a mother ensuring her child's lessons continued. But in that letter lay something deeper. Catherine's unshakable belief that her daughter must be trained not as a fragile girl, but as a sovereign mind. Latin was the language of law, theology, and diplomacy, the tongue of men who ruled. By commanding her daughter to master it, Catherine was quietly defying an entire world that said a woman's purpose was to marry, not to reign. At the age of 9, Mary was sent to Ludlow Castle, the official seat of the Council of Wales and the Marches. There, she would preside in name, at least as the head of government for Wales. It was a post traditionally reserved for male heirs. For nearly 50 years, every Prince of Wales had been dispatched to Ludlow to learn the art of kingship. That Mary followed in their footsteps was a clear sign that her father still viewed her as the rightful heir to England. Her household numbered more than 300 attendants, her seal bore the Tudor rose, and documents were issued in her name. At Ludlow, Mary's education widened beyond books. She learned governance, correspondence, and the rituals of court administration. Yet even in this role of authority, her destiny was shaped by diplomacy. Every visitor who came to Ludlow, every ambassador, every nobleman evaluated her not only as a princess but as a potential bride. The question whispered through every banquet and council meeting was not how she might rule, but whom she might marry. By the time she was 11, Mary was inspected for another French match, an alliance with the royal house of Valois. She was now only a year away from the minimum canonical age for marriage, 12, and all signs pointed toward a future as a queen consort, a symbol of unity between two realms, never a sovereign in her own right. But destiny, which had so often favoured her, turned sharply in the year 1528. That spring, Mary was summoned from Ludlow back to court. She expected ceremony and affection. Instead, she found her family collapsing. King Henry, her father, had resolved to divorce her mother. He declared that his marriage to Catherine had been cursed, that her inability to bear a living son was a sign of divine displeasure. He argued that by marrying his brother's widow, he had broken God's law. Catherine, now in her 40s, had indeed grown heavier and older in appearance, but her dignity remained intact. She refused to yield her crown, insisting that her marriage had been lawful her daughter legitimate, and her conscience clear. Yet Henry's heart had already turned elsewhere to a lady of his court, Anne Boleyn. From that moment, the royal household divided like a broken mirror. On one side stood Henry and Anne, seeking a new union and a male heir. On the other stood Catherine and Mary, the abandoned wife and the displaced daughter, clinging to faith and legitimacy. For 5 long years, the conflict raged. Henry appealed to Rome for an annulment, but Pope Clement VII refused. The king, unwilling to be denied, began to contemplate a more radical path, one that would sever England forever from papal authority. In 1533, Thomas Cranmer, recently appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, provided the solution Henry sought. Acting in defiance of the Pope, Cranmer declared the king's marriage to Catherine void and his new marriage to Anne Boleyn valid. For Mary, it was an unforgivable betrayal. The man who had once been her father's loyal cleric became, in her mind, the architect of her family's destruction. She would carry the memory of his name and her hatred to the end of her days. In the spring of 1533, Mary was 17 years old when her world shattered. Her father married Anne, and within months, Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. The child was proclaimed Princess of Wales, the title that had once belonged to Mary herself. England, for the first time, had 2 queens and 2 princesses. But Henry and Anne could not rest easy while Catherine and Mary still lived and held their titles. Orders were sent. Catherine was to renounce the name of queen, and Mary was to abandon the style of princess. When they refused, Henry's wrath fell upon them both. Mary was stripped of her title and ordered to serve in the household of the infant Elizabeth at Hatfield. There, the girl who had once been heir to the crown became a lady-in-waiting to her baby half-sister. Her servants were dismissed, her allowance reduced, her status erased. The humiliation was public and complete. Anne Boleyn, now queen, ensured that the disgrace was personal as well. Records from Hatfield describe how Anne instructed Mary's keepers to strike her if she ever referred to herself as a princess, to call her the cursed bastard whenever she refused to bow to Elizabeth. Mary endured it all in silence, her pride and her faith her only refuge. Her father, too, turned away from her. Because she would not recognize his new marriage, nor his claim to be supreme head of the Church of England, Henry declared her disobedient. He forbade her to see her mother, even when Catherine fell gravely ill. Mother and daughter were allowed only one short meeting in the span of 5 years. When Catherine died on the 7th of January, 1536, Mary was not permitted to attend her funeral. From that day, the warmth of her youth was gone. The music, the dancing, the laughter that had filled her early life were replaced by isolation and prayer. She read her Latin Bible for hours, tracing the verses with trembling fingers, whispering the same plea again and again, that God might forgive her father and grant her strength to endure. In Hatfield's cold chambers, the royal blood in her veins became both her curse and her armor. She had been adored as a future queen, and now she was branded illegitimate. Yet in that exile, something hard and luminous was forged within her. The child who had once played music in the halls of Greenwich became a woman of iron, silent, devout, and unyielding. And though she could not yet see it, the years of humiliation at Hatfield would shape the queen. She would become the queen who would rule, at last, not as a bride, but as her own father's living reckoning. At Hatfield, the walls themselves seemed to whisper humiliation. Under Queen Anne Boleyn's direct order, the household steward was given the authority to strike Mary across the face whenever she dared to call herself princess, to curse her as that damned bastard. Such cruelty was not hidden, it was deliberate, meant to remind everyone that the girl who once had servants bowing before her was now nothing more than a disgraced relic of a fallen queen. King Henry VIII, who had once called her his pearl of the world, now looked on her with cold eyes. His love, once exuberant and theatrical, had hardened into disdain. Because Mary refused to acknowledge the annulment of his marriage to Catherine and refused to recognize him as supreme head of the Church of England, Henry severed all ties. He forbade her to write to or see her mother. For 5 long years, mother and daughter were allowed only a single, brief meeting. That single reunion, awkward, tearful, and short, was both a blessing and a curse. Catherine clung to her daughter's hands, whispering prayers and words of faith, urging her to hold fast to the old church no matter what came. Mary promised she would. When they parted, neither knew it would be their last meeting on earth. From the grandeur of palaces to the loneliness of confinement, Mary learned the steep descent from privilege to abasement. Her attendants were replaced with servants loyal to Anne Boleyn. Her dresses grew plain, and her food was rationed. The world that had once bowed before her now conspired to break her spirit. Yet, instead of crumbling, Mary grew harder, her faith turning to iron, her pride into silence. By the time she reached the age of 20, she had endured what few could survive. Once adored as the heir to England, she was now declared illegitimate, disowned by her father and abandoned by her court. The contrast between her gilded childhood and her present disgrace carved deep scars into her heart. Beneath her calm exterior, resentment and conviction fused into something unyielding, a determination that one day justice divine and earthly would be restored. In the year 1536, two events occurred that would forever alter the course of Mary's life. On the 7th of January, her mother, Catherine of Aragon, died at Kimbolton Castle. When the news reached Mary, she collapsed in grief. She mourned not only the loss of a mother, but the last living symbol of legitimacy. To Mary, her mother had been both queen and martyr. In her despair, she wrote to her cousin, Emperor Charles V, pleading for refuge in Spain. She begged to be allowed to flee the godless land of her birth and find peace among her mother's kin. But fate, as always, refused to grant her escape. Only months later, Anne Boleyn, the very woman who had supplanted her mother, was arrested on charges of adultery, treason, and incest. On the 19th of May, 1536, Anne was executed within the Tower of London. For the first time in years, Mary allowed herself to hope. With Anne gone, perhaps her father's heart might soften. She began to write, flooding the court with letters first to Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief secretary, and then to the king himself. In them, she spoke humbly, almost desperately, of reconciliation. She longed to be restored to favour without betraying her conscience, to be again a daughter rather than an enemy. But Henry VIII was not a man moved by sentiment. He had endured rebellion, excommunication, and betrayal. He would not tolerate resistance in his own blood. He sent Mary a message as cold as iron. There would be no reconciliation except on his terms. She must acknowledge him as the supreme head of the Church of England, accept the annulment of his marriage to Catherine as lawful, and admit that she herself was born out of wedlock. The demand struck at the very root of Mary's soul. To obey would mean to betray her mother and her faith. To refuse would mean death. In a trembling hand, she wrote to Cromwell, "I will do all that I can, so that God and my conscience be not offended." The handwriting, once elegant and sure, broke into uneven lines, letters scattered like the fragments of her courage. Henry was unmoved. A formal declaration was prepared for her to sign. She was warned that if she refused, she would be guilty of treason punishable by death. The threat was no idle one. Barely a month earlier, her father had sent Queen Anne Boleyn to the scaffold. The message was clear. Those who remained loyal to Mary trembled for their lives. One of her closest supporters, a lady of gentle birth, wrote to her in terror, pleading for the passion of Christ, that she submit, for otherwise we are all undone. Even friendship had become dangerous. Every ally she possessed was marked, and she knew that her defiance could bring ruin to them all. In the end, fear conquered faith. Faced with the destruction of her friends, and under the shadow of the axe, Mary gave in. She signed the paper she refused even to read. In that moment, she betrayed everything she believed sacred: her mother's memory, her church, her own soul. To the world, it was a victory for the king, a daughter brought to heel. But within Mary, the act left a wound that never healed. She wrote later that her heart had died that day. And yet, as cruel fate often allows, the price of submission was not death, but a strange and hollow peace. For the next 10 years, Mary lived quietly. Her name restored to partial favour, her life spared. But the girl who had once knelt in prayer beside her mother's bed was gone. In her place remained a woman carved by loss and guilt. A woman who had learned that survival sometimes required surrender, and that even the truest faith could be buried, for a time, beneath the ashes of obedience. Outside, England moved on, its churches repainted, its altars stripped, its prayers spoken in a new tongue. But within Mary Tudor, the old faith still smouldered, waiting. The peace she had bought with her signature was fragile and false, and one day, when her time came, she would repay that bargain in blood and fire. After her reluctant submission, the balance of power shifted once more. King Henry VIII finally had what he had long desired, a male heir. With the birth of Prince Edward in the year 1537, Mary ceased to be a political threat. Her father's act of succession, confirmed by Parliament, placed the order of inheritance clearly. First Edward, then Mary, then Elizabeth. Though her legitimacy was never restored, she was at least acknowledged as a possible successor. It was a fragile form of redemption, enough to save her life, but not her pride. Still, that modest reinstatement gave her a degree of safety. For the remaining years of her father's reign, Mary lived quietly, watched but unharmed. Suitors no longer came calling. Her ambiguous status made marriage negotiations impossible. No foreign prince would wed a woman whose legitimacy could vanish with the stroke of a pen. She was a princess without a title, a daughter without a place. In January of the year 1547, King Henry died. His only son, Edward, ascended the throne as King Edward VI at just 9 years old. According to Henry's will, Mary inherited vast estates across East Anglia, much of it confiscated land that had once belonged to the Dukes of Norfolk. The properties stretched across Norfolk and Suffolk, fertile farmlands, rich manors, and quiet villages. Overnight, Mary became one of the wealthiest landowners in England. For a time, peace returned. During the first year of Edward's reign, she lived contentedly in her manors at Kenninghall and Hunsdon, surrounded by loyal servants. She heard Mass daily, managed her tenants, and corresponded occasionally with her cousin, Emperor Charles V. The storms of her youth seemed to have passed. Yet peace, in the England of the Reformation, was never meant to last. Unlike his father, Edward was a true believer in the Protestant cause. He was young, earnest, and deeply influenced by reformers such as Archbishop Thomas Cranmer and the Duke of Somerset. Henry had broken from Rome, but he had retained the outward forms of the old faith. The Latin Mass, the candles, the vestments, the music. Edward and his council sought to strip all of that away. To them, ritual was superstition. Latin was the language of tyranny. The pure word of God, they declared, must be spoken in English alone. In 1549, Parliament passed the first Act of Uniformity, making it a crime to use the Latin service. The Book of Common Prayer replaced the Old Mass. The holy altars were destroyed, the sacred images taken down, the priests forced to marry. For the reformers, it was the birth of a new England. For Mary, it was blasphemy. At the age of 31, she turned openly devout. In a world moving swiftly toward change, she moved in the opposite direction. She rose before dawn to hear Mass, attended up to 4 services each day, and spent hours in private prayer. Her chaplains, her maids, her stewards, all were instructed to keep the old ways, no matter the danger. To Mary, the Latin words of consecration, hoc est enim corpus meum, were not symbols, but miracles. The moment when bread and wine became the living body and blood of Christ. When the government outlawed the Mass, she refused to comply. Her defiance became an open secret across East Anglia. Peasants whispered that Our Lady Mary still kept the faith. Candles burned in hidden chapels. Priests fled to her estates for refuge. Her piety, once private, now carried the quiet power of rebellion. By the summer of 1549, the council in London could no longer ignore her. The young king's advisers feared she might become the rallying point for Catholic resistance. She had land, wealth, loyal servants, and, above all, a legitimate claim to the throne. When ordered to abandon the Latin rite, she calmly refused. The council threatened arrest, but the threat went unfulfilled. Even Edward, though frustrated, hesitated to provoke her. She was his sister, his godmother, and the daughter of the great Henry. The compromise was uneasy. She might continue to hear Mass, but only in private. Mary accepted the concession outwardly, but in her heart she knew it would not last. She believed the government's tolerance was merely a pause before persecution. Her sense of doom deepened into obsession. In her letters, She described England as a godless realm ruled by men who fear neither God nor man. She was haunted by memories of her father's tyranny, convinced that the same fate awaited her. Late in that same year, she summoned the imperial ambassador, Simon Renard, to her manor at Woodham Walter near the Essex coast. There, trembling but resolute, she confided her fears. "They would make a martyr of me," she said, "as my father once sought to do." Her cousin, Emperor Charles V, alarmed by her despair, proposed a desperate solution: escape. He ordered his agent, Jean Dubois, to arrange her flight to the Low Countries, where she would be safe under imperial protection. 2 ships were dispatched to the estuary near Maldon, in Essex. Under the cover of night, she was to be rowed to them and carried across the Channel to the safety of Catholic Europe. Dubois arrived in Maldon in early July, 1550. But when he met Sir Robert Rochester, Mary's most trusted steward, he found resistance. Rochester warned that the ports were under watch. The government would surely discover the plot. Worse, if the young King Edward were to die while Mary was in exile, she would forfeit all claim to the throne. Rochester confided that he had even consulted astrologers who predicted that Edward's health was failing and that he would not live beyond the year. Mary was torn between fear and duty. One evening, Dubois found her in chaos, her chambers littered with half-packed trunks, clothing and books stuffed hastily into rough linen sacks. She was weeping, muttering prayers, unable to decide. Should she flee and live, or stay and face the gallows? In that long night of indecision, something within her changed. The panic subsided, replaced by a strange calm. She began to believe that God himself had placed her in England for a purpose, that her suffering was not to end in flight but in fulfillment. She would not run, she would wait. And in that act of stillness, Mary Tudor, once the frightened daughter, the humiliated bastard, the reluctant rebel, began to transform into the woman who would one day seize the crown. The ship sailed away without her, empty, their sails fading into the mist. And on the grey shores of Essex, as dawn broke, Mary knelt to pray, no longer a fugitive, but a soul convinced that God had chosen her to stand her ground. In the summer of the year 1553, the boy king Edward VI lay dying. He was only 15 years old. Thin, fevered, and consumed by tuberculosis, he spent his final weeks surrounded by ministers and clergymen more concerned with the future of the throne than the fate of the child who wore the crown. Edward, a devout Protestant, feared that his elder sister Mary, a steadfast Catholic, would undo the reformation that had defined his reign. Against the clear terms of his father's will, he wrote a new device for succession, naming his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as heir to the throne of England. On the 6th of July 1553, Edward died at Greenwich Palace. His death was kept secret for several days while John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, moved swiftly to secure Jane's position. On the 10th of July, Lady Jane Grey, a girl of 16, was proclaimed Queen of England. Bells rang half-heartedly in London, and proclamations were read in marketplaces, but few felt joy. Even the imperial ambassadors of Emperor Charles V, who was Mary's cousin, acknowledged Jane's claim, at least for the moment. The realm seemed poised to continue under Protestant rule, but they had underestimated Mary Tudor. Now 37 years old, she was no longer the frightened daughter who had once signed away her conscience. Hardened by humiliation and loss, she believed herself not only the lawful heir of her father's crown, but also the chosen instrument of God's justice. When she heard of Edward's death, she acted at once. Mary rode eastward to Framlingham Castle, her great fortress in the heart of her East Anglian estates. There, in the rolling farmlands and small villages that had long been loyal to her, she raised her standard, the banner of the Tudor Rose. She summoned her tenants, her household officers, and the neighbouring gentry to join her cause. Her call spread like wildfire. Within days, armed men began to pour into Framlingham from Suffolk, Norfolk, and Cambridge. What astonished all observers was how wide her support became. It was not only Catholics who rallied to her side. Even moderate Protestants and former servants of her father joined her ranks, not for religion but for legitimacy. Mary was, after all, a Tudor, the daughter of King Henry VIII, and in her they saw the rightful heir, the the symbol of continuity and lawful succession. As Mary moved through East Anglia, opposition melted away like mist in the morning. From Gloucester to Yorkshire, proclamations were made in her name. Within 2 weeks, she commanded an army of at least 15,000 men. Yet not a single major battle was fought. The people themselves delivered the kingdom to her. In London, Northumberland's cause collapsed. His troops deserted, the council turned against him, and Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days' Queen, was quietly abandoned by those who had raised her. On the 3rd of August, 1553, Mary entered London in triumph. The city's bells rang without cease. Bonfires blazed in every street, and from St. Paul's Cathedral rose the solemn music of Te Deum Laudamus. We praise thee, O Lord. The woman once called a bastard was now the crowned Queen of England. At 37, Mary Tudor had accomplished what no woman before her had ever done. She had taken the throne not through marriage or inheritance arranged by others, but through her own claim and the will of the people. The world called it a miracle. With her coronation came the power to reshape her own story. One of her first acts as queen was to set right what she believed had been the great injustice of her father's reign. A new Act of Parliament declared that there had been a conspiracy, led by Thomas Cranmer, to divorce Henry VIII from Catherine of Aragon and to bastardize their daughter. The Act affirmed that Henry and Catherine had been lawfully married in the eyes of God, and that Mary was therefore the rightful heir to the throne. Legally, such a declaration was unnecessary. She already reigned by the consent of the nation. But for Mary it was deeply personal. The law did not merely rewrite the record, it healed her own wound. The world at last recognized what she had always known in her heart, that she was legitimate, that her mother's honor was restored, and that her faith had been vindicated. But once the past was corrected, Mary turned her eyes to the future. Her cousin, Emperor Charles V, urged her to marry, and he proposed a candidate, his son, Prince Philip of Spain. It was an advantageous match politically, an alliance between England and the vast Habsburg Empire, but also a dangerous one. Philip was a Spaniard, and the English people, long wary of foreign influence, were appalled by the thought of a Spanish king. The fear spread that England would become a vassal of the empire, its crown subordinate to Spain. Parliament hesitated. The Privy Council murmured dissent. Pamphlets began to circulate, some mocking, some threatening. Yet Mary, as always, turned to prayer. She withdrew to her private chapel, and, with her ladies and the imperial ambassador beside her, knelt before the sacrament. They sang Veni Creator Spiritus, Come, Holy Ghost. When the hymn ended, Mary rose, her eyes bright, her voice calm but resolute. Just as God chose Joseph to be the husband of the Virgin Mary, she said, so too has he chosen a husband for me. His name is Philip. From that moment, her decision was fixed. No argument, no protest, no plea from her counselors could move her. She swore upon the sacrament that she would marry Philip, and that those whom God hath joined, no man shall put asunder. It was an act of faith and of fate. For in that solemn vow, spoken in the hush of her chapel, Mary bound not only her heart but her kingdom to a future neither she nor her people could yet see. The murmurs of dissent grew louder in the streets, the fear of Spanish dominion spreading through London like smoke before a storm. And even as she prayed, the ground beneath her new throne began to tremble, for, from the county of Kent, would soon rise the rebellion of Thomas Wyatt, and with it, the first test of the Queen who believed her crown was forged by the hand of God himself. News of Queen Mary's betrothal to Prince Philip of Spain struck England like a thunderclap. The thought of a foreign king, and worse, a Spaniard from the mighty Habsburg Empire, ignited fear across the realm. The English people remembered the long wars against Spain, and they dreaded becoming a vassal to the Emperor Charles V. The idea that England might be ruled by a foreign husband, that her laws and liberties might bend to the will of Spain, turned the air thick with suspicion. By the opening months of the year 1554, murmurs had hardened into rebellion. In the county of Kent, a wealthy gentleman named Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger gathered more than 3,000 men. His aim was bold and simple: to depose Queen Mary and place her half-sister Elizabeth on the throne, married to an Englishman. The cry of the insurgents was, "For God, for country, and for liberty." As Wyatt's army advanced toward London, panic gripped the capital. The royal forces were thin, the loyalty of the guards uncertain. Each day brought fresh rumours that Wyatt had crossed the Thames, that the city gates would fall, that the Queen would flee. From the windows of Whitehall, Mary could hear the distant drums of rebellion echoing through the winter air. Yet Mary refused to run. On the first day of February, 1554, she made her way to the Guildhall in London. Dressed in deep crimson velvet, the colour of courage and martyrdom, she ascended the wooden platform from which the city's politicians usually spoke during elections. Before her stood aldermen, merchants and citizens, anxious, divided, uncertain of their queen. When Mary began to speak, her voice was calm but resonant, carrying across the crowded hall. "I am your lawful and crowned queen," she declared. "I have come to live or die among you for my people." Then she lifted her hand, showing the gold coronation ring that had never left her finger. "With this ring," she said softly, "I married my realm. It has never left my hand, nor will it ever do so." She spoke of love, not power, of the bond between queen and country. She told them that though she had never borne a child, she loved her people as a mother loves her children, and she swore that she would never marry without the counsel and consent of Parliament and her people. It was not a political speech. It was a vow. Those who heard her that day later recalled that the hall fell utterly silent. Some wept. The Londoners, whose hearts had wavered, found their faith again in that moment. The daughter of Henry VIII had inherited more than his crown. She had his presence, his command of the crowd. Meanwhile, outside the city, chaos reigned. Wyatt's army crossed the Thames at Kingston and pushed through Knightsbridge, their banners tattered, their men exhausted by the winter cold. In London, confusion spread among the royal guards. Some panicked, others fled. Yet the city itself, inspired by Mary's resolve, stood firm. The gates were barred, the drawbridges raised. Wyatt reached the western outskirts of London on the 7th of February, only to find the capital shut against him. Trapped and surrounded, his men began to desert. Before dawn, he surrendered without a fight. Mary had won. The rebellion was crushed without the spilling of blood in battle, a triumph of will and words rather than swords. Her courage at Guildhall was praised across Europe. Even her enemies admitted she had shown the heart of a true monarch. She had faced down an armed revolt with nothing but conviction, and she had prevailed. Thomas Wyatt and his fellow conspirators were executed soon after. The heads of the rebellion rolled from the scaffold, their bodies displayed as a warning to others who might challenge the Queen. But one prisoner caused Mary more pain than all the rest. Her half-sister Elizabeth, the young woman whose name had been used as a banner for the rebels, was arrested and sent to the Tower of London. Mary could not risk letting her live freely, not when the realm still trembled with unrest. For years, jealousy and distrust had simmered between the sisters, born from the rivalry of their mothers. Now, political necessity gave Mary a reason to confine her. Elizabeth entered the same tower where their mother, Anne Boleyn, had awaited execution 16 years earlier. It was a grim echo of history. The rebellion of Kent ended as swiftly as it had begun. London returned to its uneasy peace. Bonfires were lit in the squares, this time not to celebrate war but to mark survival. Mary, though victorious, was changed. She had stood before her people and felt their fear, their uncertainty, their love. The speech at Guildhall had taught her something she had not learned from the prayers of her youth or the power of her crown, that a ruler must speak to the hearts of her subjects, not only to their obedience. For a brief moment, the Queen, who had been shaped by isolation, discovered communion not in a chapel, but among her people. The road ahead was clearer now. With the rebellion extinguished and her authority affirmed, no one could deny her the right to marry whom she pleased. The preparations for her union with Philip resumed, the negotiations completed. England, weary but subdued, accepted what it could not change. Yet beneath the calm surface, the kingdom was restless still. The wounds left by Wyatt's rising had not healed, and whispers spread that a Spanish marriage would bring not blessings but chains. Mary did not hear them, or perhaps she chose not to. She believed her choice was sanctified by heaven, her future sealed by divine will. And so, with peace restored and the throne secure, the Queen began to move toward her destiny, a marriage born of faith and politics, a union that would test not only her heart but the very soul of her reign. It was a quiet February evening when she looked out from her chamber window over the dark rooftops of London. The fires of rebellion had burned out, the city slept, and in the distance the bells of street Paul's tolled softly through the fog. Mary crossed herself and whispered, "God's will be done." She had survived the storm. But the greater trials of love, of faith, and of flame were still to come. On the 25th day of July, in the year 1554, the bells of Winchester rang out across the summer air as Queen Mary made her way toward the great cathedral. It was to be her wedding day, a ceremony not only of two sovereigns, but of two worlds. From the western doors of Winchester Cathedral stretched a long raised walkway of timber, built especially for the occasion. It ran the full length of the nave to the choir steps, like a bridge suspended between the past and the future. Along this path, Mary Tudor, Queen of England, walked in solemn grace, every step echoing the weight of destiny. Four noblemen of the highest rank, acting in the name of England, escorted her to the platform where the ceremony would take place. Above her, light fell through the tall stained-glass windows, scattering red and gold across the flagstones, the colours of Spain and of martyrdom. The wedding followed the old Catholic rite. Before the gathered lords and clergy, Mary spoke her vows in Latin, her voice steady and clear. In that ancient formula, the bride promised to be bonny and buxom in bed and board, gentle, cheerful, and obedient both in private and in public life. It was a phrase already antiquated in her time, yet Mary insisted it be kept. To her it was more than custom. It was a declaration that this was a true marriage, a union of hearts as well as crowns. When the time came for the exchange of rings, she refused the jewelled bands of modern fashion. Instead, she extended her hand for a simple ring of plain gold. As maidens were in the olden times, she said softly. In that small gesture lay her entire creed, a yearning to restore what had been broken, to mend the chain of tradition that the Reformation had severed. Prince Philip, her groom, waited beside her. He was 27 years old, tall, reserved, and every inch the son of Emperor Charles V. To his Spanish courtiers, the English queen seemed devout, dignified, but unremarkable, her dress too modest, her demeanour too solemn for a royal bride. One chronicler described her as a perfect saint who dressed badly. Another, closer to Philip, praised his master's patience and tact, remarking that he has shown great skill in managing a wife from whom he can expect neither pleasure nor satisfaction. But Mary, blinded by love and faith, saw only virtue. To her, Philip was the living answer to her prayers. In a letter written shortly after the wedding to her cousin and now father-in-law, the Emperor, she confessed, "This marriage and alliance render me happier than I can say, for I daily discover in my king, my husband and your son, so many virtues and perfections that I constantly pray God to grant me grace to please him." To the court and the people of England, the marriage was more than personal. It was political salvation. The union was presented as the dawn of a new era, the restoration of Catholic England. After 20 years of schism from Rome, the Queen's marriage to the Catholic Prince of Spain was hailed as a divine sign that the great wound between England and the Holy See would at last be healed. The ceremonies reflected that hope. The cathedral was draped in cloth of gold, choirs sang the Gloria, bishops processed with incense, and at the high altar the marriage was sealed beneath the great cross. It was grandeur not seen since the days before her father's break with Rome. Yet behind the hymns and pageantry, unease persisted. The question lingered like smoke in the air. Who would truly rule England now? The Queen or her foreign husband? The marriage treaty, drafted with care, tried to soothe these fears. It declared that Philip would bear the title of king but hold no authority apart from Mary's. No foreigner could hold office in England. No lands or revenues would pass to Spain. But the people remained unconvinced. In taverns and marketplaces, they whispered that England would soon be overrun by Spaniards, that its gold would flow south, its independence vanish beneath the weight of empire. The spectre of Spanish rule hung over every celebration. Mary, however, saw only divine purpose. To her, the marriage was not merely an alliance of nations, but an act of redemption. It would, she believed, erase the stain of illegitimacy that had haunted her since childhood. By giving birth to a son, a true heir, she would secure both her dynasty and her faith. Her child would be the symbol of England's reconciliation with God. For Philip, the match was far colder in spirit. To him, the marriage was a maneuver within the vast chessboard of Europe, a way to extend Habsburg influence and secure England as a counterweight against France. He obeyed his father's wishes, performed his duties with dignity, but his heart remained distant. Still, on that July morning, the two knelt together at the altar. Hands joined, their fates bound by ceremony. The priests chanted prayers in Latin, invoking blessings upon the union. Outside, the crowds cheered, though many did not know whether they rejoiced for Mary's happiness or for England's uncertainty. When the vows were spoken and the Mass concluded, the bells of Winchester pealed again, echoing across the green hills of Hampshire. It was the sound of a queen fulfilled, a kingdom divided, and a destiny newly sealed. That day, as the sun set behind the cathedral's spires, Mary Tudor became not only the wife of Philip of Spain, but the visible face of a restored Catholic order. To her, it was the beginning of a holy renewal. To others, it marked the quiet beginning of a darker age. The marriage of Winchester, gilded with ritual and crowned in faith, bound Mary's private longing to the public mission of her reign. From that moment onward, her life and the future of England would be inseparable. Two souls joined, as she believed, by God himself, and destined to burn together in the long twilight of her rule. When Mary Tudor ascended the throne in the year 1553, England had been severed from the authority of Rome for nearly 20 years. Under her father, King Henry VIII, monasteries and abbeys had been dissolved, their lands confiscated and sold, their treasures melted down and scattered. Her brother Edward's reign had carried the transformation, further stripping altars, erasing Latin from the Mass, replacing saints' days with sermons. By the time Mary came to power, England was no longer the England of her childhood. It was a nation remade in the image of reform. Mary's mission was clear from the beginning. She would undo it all, not merely to restore ties with Rome, but to rewrite the moral history of her country, to declare that Catholicism was not a foreign creed imposed by the past, but the true soul of England itself. The Protestant years of Henry and Edward were, to her mind, nothing more than a brief detour, a period of rebellion and error that divine providence had now called her to correct. Her first acts as queen reflected that conviction. Parliament, under her command, passed legislation confirming that the marriage between Henry and Catherine of Aragon had been lawful in the sight of God. The law proclaimed that Mary was legitimate, born of a true and sacramental union, and that her mother's honour was to be fully restored. It was both political decree and private absolution, the crown's first act of contrition. With the past thus cleansed, Mary turned to the greater task, healing England's breach with the Church. She and her council prepared a public ceremony that would mark the formal reconciliation of the kingdom with the Holy See. On the 24th day of November, in the year 1554, the papal legate, Cardinal Reginald Pole, arrived at court. The hall was resplendent with crimson hangings and flickering candlelight. Before the assembled peers and bishops, he greeted the Queen with words that stirred every listener. "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." It was a greeting heavy with symbol. For the Queen, who bore the same name as the Virgin, the words were more than protocol, they were prophecy. In that moment, Mary felt her mission sanctified, as though heaven itself had spoken through the envoy. Only days later, whispers spread through the court. The Queen believed herself to be with child. She confided to her attendants that she had felt movement in her womb. "The babe hath stirred within me," she said. To a kingdom starved of continuity, the news fell like a benediction. A Catholic heir, born of the Queen and the Spanish prince, would secure both the dynasty and the faith. The spring of 1555 arrived in a haze of expectancy. Following the ancient custom of Queens of England, Mary withdrew into seclusion at Hampton Court Palace for her confinement. The palace, already vast, was transformed into a sanctuary. Heavy curtains were drawn, windows were covered with tapestries, the air filled with the scent of incense and wax. The greatest ladies of the realm were summoned to serve as witnesses to the birth. Cradles were carved and polished, swaddling clothes embroidered with the Tudor rose and the double-headed eagle of Spain. Rockers were hired, midwives chosen, and wet nurses placed on call. Even the servants spoke in whispers, as if afraid to disturb the fragile promise forming behind the palace walls. At last, England seemed united in a single prayer. The birth of the prince, the long-awaited Catholic heir, would bind together heaven and earth, queen and people, church and crown. Meanwhile, Mary and Philip pursued the other part of their shared mission. Across the land, Latin Mass was restored to the churches. The old vestments and altars were brought back from hiding. The bishops loyal to Rome reclaimed their sees. Confession, communion, baptism, and the other sacraments returned to public life. For Mary, these were not mere rituals. They were acts of salvation, the nation itself being shriven, cleansed of the blasphemy that had defiled it. Those who resisted, she believed, were not simply heretics but traitors to the divine order of England. And so, as winter faded into spring, the air of the realm was thick with devotion and suspense. The chapels rang once more with choral Latin. The scent of incense drifted through the cloisters. Tailors and seamstresses bent over the fine linen of the royal infant's garments. Hampton Court echoed with the soft hum of preparation, the murmur of nurses, the rhythm of looms, the quiet litanies of waiting women. To an onlooker, it might have seemed as though the whole kingdom was holding its breath, poised on the edge of renewal. The bells of London tolled in anticipation. Preachers spoke of divine mercy. Pilgrims lit candles for the safety of the Queen. In those weeks, hope itself took on the form of sound, the rustle of silks in the corridors, the ringing of chapel bells, the distant footsteps of courtiers bearing news. Every moment seemed to lead toward one promise, that soon a child would cry, and England would be reborn. But fate, silent and unseen, had already set its hand against her. Behind the veils of the Queen's private chambers, the hours dragged on without change. Days turned to weeks, and still no labour came. Physicians whispered of delays. Courtiers exchanged nervous glances. Outside, the spring rains darkened the courtyards, and the people of England who had prayed so fervently began to murmur their doubts. Inside Hampton Court, the Queen continued her vigil, believing the will of God could not be mistaken. She prayed before the crucifix, her hands clasped over the stillness of her body, waiting for the life that refused to come. And thus the moment of promise, the bright, breathless anticipation of a new dawn, began to dim. The kingdom, still wrapped in pageantry and faith, did not yet know it was standing at the threshold of disappointment. The bells had rung for a birth that would never come, and the silence that followed would echo longer than any hymn. May came and went, and still there was no cry of a newborn in Hampton Court. The waiting had stretched into unease, then into dread. On the first day of June, Queen Mary reported that she had felt the pains of labour. Her physicians, eager to reassure her and the court, predicted that the child would be born on the 6th. But the 6th passed in silence. No cradle was filled, no herald announced the birth of a prince. The corridors of the palace, once hushed with reverence, now hummed with whispers. The Queen, some said, was not pregnant at all. Others insisted she was gravely ill. The most vicious rumour claimed that ministers were searching for a newborn child to smuggle into the palace, to deceive the nation with a false heir. What had been joy turned to confusion, then to scorn. Outside, storms rolled across the countryside. The harvest failed, and rain drowned the fields. In taverns and marketplaces, the mood darkened. Laughter turned to uneasy jokes about the Queen's miracle. By the end of July, only Mary herself still believed. She clung to her faith with desperate certainty. The messenger of God, she said, could not have lied. The babe had stirred within her, therefore the promise must be real. To doubt would be to sin. Her ladies, fearful of her wrath and pitying her delusion, continued to sew tiny garments and prepare the cradle, though their eyes were downcast and their hands trembled. At last, on the 4th day of August, the fiction ended. Without proclamation or ceremony, the Queen quietly left Hampton Court. The confinement chambers were sealed, the cradles put away. The pregnancy, whether phantom or the symptom of illness, was over. The truth was plain: there would be no heir. Historians later called it a false pregnancy, perhaps caused by dropsy, perhaps by a tumour. But to her contemporaries, it was a humiliation beyond words. The entire kingdom had prayed for a child. Now it whispered of divine disfavour. The failure wounded Mary's reputation, her authority, and her marriage alike. Philip of Spain, finding no son to secure his English alliance, and pressed by urgent affairs in the Low Countries, decided to depart. He promised to return soon, but Mary knew what such promises meant. On a grey morning, she watched from a window overlooking the Thames as his ships sailed downriver, their masts fading into the mist. For hours, she remained by the casement, her hands clasped, her face pale. The river carried her husband away, and with him, her last fragile hope of happiness. Yet sorrow did not soften her resolve. If anything, it hardened her. In the months that followed, Mary turned her attention fully to the one cause that had never betrayed her, her faith. Her grief became devotion, her disappointment transformed into righteous fury. England, she declared, must be purified. The heresy that had infected it under her father and brother could not simply be forgiven. It had to be burned out, root and branch. The soul of the nation, she believed, was sick, and fire was the only cure. Thus began the burnings. The first victims were humble men, hardly leaders of any movement: Hugh Laverock, a lame old man, and John Aprisa, a blind one. They were carried together in a cart to the stake at Stratford-le-Bow. Witnesses said they went most quietly, praising God even as the flames rose around them. Elizabeth Cooper, condemned for her faith, stood still as the fire took her. Like one glad to finish that good work, John Leaf, a young apprentice, lifted his eyes to heaven and cried, "O England, England, repent of thy sins," before the smoke choked his voice. These deaths, recorded later by John Foxe in the Book of Martyrs, were the first sparks in what would become an inferno. Over the next 2 years, more than 300 men and women would perish in the flames, their names written in the margins of history, their ashes mingling with the soil of English towns. To the Queen, these executions were not cruelty but duty. In her world, heresy was not merely false belief. It was rebellion against God himself, and rebellion demanded the harshest penalty. She saw herself not as a persecutor but as a physician, cauterizing the wound of a diseased nation. To cleanse the soul of England was, to her, an act of mercy. But mercy, as her people saw it, wore the face of terror. The fires that burned for faith also burned away her popularity. The scent of smoke drifted over market squares. Bells tolled not for celebration but for death. Villagers whispered the Queen's name with dread. And still, Mary prayed. Each morning she knelt before the crucifix and begged forgiveness for those who had died, believing their pain would lead them to salvation. Each evening, she asked God to strengthen her resolve to continue his work. Yet history, which spares neither love nor faith, judged her differently. The flames she lit to save souls became, in the eyes of her people, the mark of a tyrant. The woman who once rode through London hailed as England's deliverer now found her name darkened by fear. The title, whispered first in anger and then in legend, would cling to her long after her body had turned to dust. Bloody Mary. In that single name, pity and horror mingled. It was the echo of her faith, her loneliness, and her conviction all consumed in the same fire that had devoured her victims. By the time the last embers of the year 1555 died out, the dream of a Catholic England was already beginning to flicker. The childless Queen sat alone, her crown heavy, her hands cold, her prayers unending. And outside her palace walls, the wind that carried the ashes of martyrs also carried the first whispers of doubt. The quiet prophecy that one day her fires would burn no more. By the year 1556, the flames that Queen Mary had kindled in the name of faith reached their fiercest height. Across England, the smell of burning wood had become as familiar as incense. But among all the victims who met their end in the roaring fires, one name stood apart: Thomas Cranmer. Once the Archbishop of Canterbury, Cranmer had been the very architect of Mary's lifelong suffering. It was he who, over 2 decades earlier, had declared her mother's marriage to Henry VIII null and void. He who had proclaimed Anne Boleyn queen. He who had legitimized Elizabeth, while branding Mary a bastard. For her, no man embodied the heresy of reform and the cruelty of betrayal more completely than he did. Now old, frail, and imprisoned for years, Cranmer faced his final reckoning. Before the court, his body was bent, his voice unsteady. The charge was heresy defiance of the true church and of the papal authority Mary had restored. Condemned to die by fire, he pleaded for mercy. But mercy, to him, meant renouncing the cause he had spent his life advancing. At first, he resisted. Then, broken by fear and weakness, he yielded. He wrote a full confession, acknowledging the Pope as Christ's vicar and the Mass as the true sacrifice. To the government, it was a triumph of propaganda the chief heretic himself had recanted. According to the law, a penitent heretic was to be spared. But mercy was not the justice Mary sought. Whether from personal vengeance or divine conviction, she intervened. Contemporary accounts and the writings of John Foxe suggest that Mary insisted Cranmer be executed despite his repentance. The Queen, it was said, desired not merely to silence him, but to erase his name from history in the same flames that had consumed her mother's dignity. Still, her council saw one last use for him. Cranmer was ordered to make a public declaration of his repentance before his death. A wooden platform was raised in Street, Mary's Church at Oxford, where scholars, clergy and townspeople gathered to witness the spectacle. On the 21st day of March, 1556, Cranmer ascended the stage. The parchment containing his confession trembled in his hands. He began to read, his voice low and even. He confessed his sins, his errors, his false teachings. The crowd murmured approval. But then, suddenly, his tone changed. He paused, folded the paper, and looked up. What he said next froze the hall in astonishment. He renounced his recantation. He declared that he had written it out of cowardice, not conviction. He cried that the Pope was Christ's enemy and Antichrist, that the Mass was idolatry, and that his only true faith was in the Word of God. Gasps rose from the congregation. Shouts of fury and horror followed. He was dragged from the stage before he could say more. Outside, the stake awaited him. When the fire was lit, Cranmer performed one final act of defiance. He stretched out his right hand, the hand that had signed the recantation, and thrust it into the flames. "This hand hath offended," he said, "and it shall burn first." Witnesses later wrote that he held it there without flinching as the skin blackened and the fingers curled. The woodcut in Foxe's Book of Martyrs immortalized that moment, the thin figure in the flames, the outstretched hand, the onlookers recoiling in awe. The Queen had sought to destroy him, but instead she gave him a martyr's crown. His death did more to strengthen the Protestant cause than his life ever had, and as Cranmer's ashes scattered in the Oxford wind, Mary's reign began to falter. The years that followed brought not triumph but trial. 3 consecutive harvests failed, and famine stalked the land. A deadly influenza epidemic swept through towns and villages, claiming tens of thousands of lives. The same year, reports reached England of Philip's infidelities on the continent. The Queen, worn by loneliness, wrote letter after letter to her absent husband, begging his return. "I have begun to taste too much jealousy," she confessed in one, "which is worse to me than death." Philip did return, but only for 4 months. His heart and his duties remained abroad. When he left England again, Mary once more believed herself with child. Convinced of another divine sign, she began preparing her will. In it, she imagined a Catholic England secured for the future, ruled by the child yet unborn, who would continue her holy work. But by May of 1558, her body betrayed her once again. There was no child, only illness. The swelling in her abdomen worsened. Her strength failed. The physicians whispered of cancer, or perhaps another phantom pregnancy. Whatever the cause, her end was drawing near. The fires that had once lit the skies of England now burned against her memory. The executions that she had seen as acts of faith had instead turned her people against her. Hunger, disease, and the unending smoke of martyrs' pyres had darkened her image beyond repair. The Queen who believed she was saving souls had become, in the eyes of many, a figure of fear. Yet in her heart, Mary never saw herself as cruel. She believed her mission divine, her suffering righteous, her loneliness the price of obedience to God. She had loved deeply, prayed fervently, and ruled with conviction, but the world judged her by the flames. As the year waned, England itself seemed to fade with her. The once proud fortress of Calais, England's last possession in France, fell to the French army after 211 years under the English crown. The news struck Mary like a mortal wound. "When I am dead," she said, "they will find Calais written on my heart." Her illness deepened through the autumn. She refused to name Elizabeth her heir until the last, fearing to entrust her hard-won Catholic restoration to her Protestant sister. But even Mary knew death was near. And so, as November's chill crept into her chamber, the woman once crowned in triumph lay silent, her rosary between her fingers, her crown already a memory. The queen who had loved too fiercely, believed too completely, and burned too brightly, was fading, leaving behind a kingdom divided, and a legend forever marked by fire. By the winter of the year 1557, Queen Mary's body was failing. The spark that had once burned so fiercely within her had begun to dim. Years of anxiety, illness, and disappointment had eroded her strength. Her mind, too, bore the marks of exhaustion weighed down by grief, loneliness, and unshakable conviction. And just as her life's light began to flicker, another blow fell, one so devastating that even her faith trembled before it. It came from across the Channel. For 211 years, the port of Calais had been England's last foothold on the soil of France, the remnant of Edward III's great conquests, a symbol of the empire that once had stretched deep into the continent. It was more than a military outpost. It was a relic of glory, a living connection to the age when English kings had ruled not only their island, but vast lands beyond it. In January of the year 1558, that legacy was erased. The French, under the command of Francois, Duke of Guise, launched a swift and unexpected assault. The English garrison, outnumbered and unprepared, could not hold the walls. The winter winds off the Channel carried the thunder of cannon across the dunes, and within a week Calais fell. The news reached London like a funeral bell. In the council chambers, silence hung heavy. In the streets, disbelief turned to despair. Generations had grown up knowing Calais as England's unbreakable fortress, our bright jewel in France. Now it was gone. For Mary, the loss was unbearable. It was not merely the fall of a city, it was the shattering of her own sense of divine purpose. She had seen herself as the victorious queen of a restored Catholic England, chosen by God to redeem her father's sins and her nation's heresy. The fall of Calais mocked that vision. To her, it was more than a defeat in arms. It was a spiritual rebuke. "God has turned his face from us," she whispered, when the messenger laid the dispatch before her. Those who attended her said she sat motionless for a long time, her eyes fixed on the map spread before her, the place where Calais had once stood circled in ink. Then, in a faint voice, she said the words that history would remember. "When I am dead, they will find Calais written upon my heart." Oh, the shock struck her already frail body like a mortal wound. Fever followed, then pain. Her physicians, uncertain as always, spoke in low tones of a wasting disease, perhaps of the womb, perhaps of the liver. Some modern scholars believe it was ovarian cancer. Others, the lingering consequence of infection. But those who watched her decline saw in it something more simple and more tragic, a heart that had lost its reason to endure. Still, she would not let go of her faith. In her eyes, the fall of Calais was no mere military failure, but a chastisement, God's punishment for England's unrepented sins. The heresy she had tried to burn out had, she believed, still tainted the nation's soul. Only through suffering, she told her attendants, could England be purified. "It is the Lord's will," she murmured, "and his will cannot be unjust." Meanwhile, her husband was far away. Philip of Spain, now king of a vast empire that stretched from the Low Countries to the Americas, was engaged in war upon the continent. To him, the loss of Calais was a strategic misfortune. To Mary, it was a wound beyond healing. He sent letters of comfort but did not return. The Queen's own letters from this time are few and brief. The handwriting wavers. The words are heavy with resignation. She no longer spoke of triumphs or policies, only of prayer, penitence, and the inscrutable will of God. "My body fails me," she wrote in one of her last known letters, "but my soul is steadfast. The Lord corrects whom he loves." Outside the court, England groaned under the weight of calamity. 3 years of poor harvests had brought famine. Disease or fever the people called the new influenza swept through towns and villages, sparing neither rich nor poor. The fires of persecution still burned in the public squares, but the crowds who once gathered now came in sullen silence. The faith that Mary had hoped to restore with flame and blood had instead driven her people into quiet despair. By the summer of 1558, the Queen began to cough blood. Her ladies found her sitting by the window of St. James's Palace, pale and still, staring out into the grey London sky. At times she spoke to herself, whispering prayers. At others, she drifted into confusion, murmuring Philip's name. As autumn deepened, her strength failed. Her meals went untouched. Her voice grew weaker each day. Courtiers moved through the corridors with lowered eyes, speaking in whispers. Everyone knew what was coming, though none dared to say it aloud. The realm had entered a strange stillness, the hush that precedes the end. Ministers prepared for succession. Bishops prayed for her soul. Even her enemies, remembering her devotion, began to feel a sombre pity. And through it all, Mary continued to pray. Each night, the sound of her rosary beads clicking softly echoed through the chamber, the rhythm of faith holding against the tide of death. She asked not for healing, but for absolution. She believed the trials of her reign, the rebellion, the false pregnancies, the loss of her child, her husband, and now Calais were all part of a divine pattern. Her suffering was the nation's penance, her body the vessel of its purification. But as the days shortened and the light faded from her eyes, the truth no longer mattered. The Queen who had lived for faith and died for conviction was slipping away, her prayers mingling with the sound of distant church bells tolling for the soul of England itself. By November, everyone in court knew. The end was near. The fires that once lit her reign had cooled to embers. The woman who had once stood before her people, crowned and radiant, was now a figure of pale devotion, waiting in silence for the hand of God. And beyond her chamber walls, the wind moved through the bare branches of London, carrying with it the last echo of her reign, a whisper of fire, faith, and unrelenting sorrow. By September of the year 1558, Queen Mary's body had become a fragile vessel, barely able to contain her spirit. The fevers came in waves fierce, unrelenting, leaving her shivering under layers of linen. Her breath grew short. Her skin turned ashen. Her eyes, once bright with conviction, now clouded with the mist of exhaustion. At times, she slipped into what her attendants called holy trances, murmuring of visions that seemed to hover between this world and the next. She said she saw children dressed in white, singing like angels. The physicians could do little. They spoke in hushed tones of dropsy of the womb or disease of the heart, but no remedy eased her pain. Only prayer remained. And so, even as her body failed, Mary clung to her last mission to ensure that England would not stray again from the embrace of Rome after her death. It was her final purpose, the thread that held her to life. Despite her weakness, she refused to name her half-sister Elizabeth as heir unless the younger woman swore to preserve the Catholic faith. The council pressed her to relent. Elizabeth was young, quick-minded, and already beloved by the people her very presence, a living contrast to the dying queen. To Mary, she was more than a rival. She was a living reminder of all that had broken her. When Mary looked upon her sister, she did not see a successor, she saw Anne Boleyn. The eyes, the tilt of the chin, the grace of youth all seemed an echo of the woman who had destroyed her mother and turned her childhood into exile. The thought that such blood might once again rule England tormented her to the end. Yet she had no choice. There were no heirs of her body. Philip was gone, his letters sparse and formal. The few allies she had among the nobility were themselves weary of the fires and the famine. England, sick and starved, was ready for change. Her councillors, led by Lord Chancellor Gardiner and the Lord Treasurer Paget, told her plainly that the stability of the realm depended upon a clear succession. At last, after days of prayer and pleading, Mary yielded. Her hand, swollen and trembling, signed the paper that named Elizabeth as her lawful heir, but she added with fading voice a final clause. The new queen must maintain the true faith of Holy Church. Those who watched knew the words carried no force. They were not law, only hope, the last wish of a dying believer who could not bear to see her life's work undone. In truth, the England Mary left behind was already turning away from her. The people who had once cheered her entry into London now lit no candles for her recovery. The fires of persecution had burned too long, and hunger had turned reverence into resentment. Even within the palace, silence reigned. Courtiers walked softly through the corridors, their faces pale and their voices low, as if the walls themselves mourned. Mary was only 42, not old by Tudor reckoning, but she seemed ancient, her face carved by sorrow. Her hair, once red gold like her father's, had thinned to grey. Her lips were bloodless, her hands so cold that her ladies warmed them between their own. Each night she asked to be left alone to pray. Servants passing her chamber heard her voice through the door, low, broken, chanting in Latin, Ave Maria, gratia plena. Sometimes she wept as she prayed. Other times she sang softly, her words drifting through the candlelit air like fragments of a forgotten hymn. She prayed for her mother, Catherine of Aragon. She prayed for Philip, for his safety and salvation. She prayed for England not for its power or peace, but for its soul. She begged God to forgive her people for their rebellion, and to forgive her for her failures as their queen. Those who kept vigil said that, even in her last hours, she murmured of her faith and her mother, speaking of them as one and the same. The two Marys, she whispered once, meaning the Virgin and Catherine, the two women who had shaped her heart. By early November, she could no longer rise from her bed. Her confessor brought her the sacrament. She received it with trembling hands, her lips barely touching the chalice. "I am not worthy," she said faintly, "but his mercy endureth forever." Outside, the air had turned to winter. The city that had once blazed with bonfires now stood cold and grey. Philip remained abroad. No letter came. The council gathered in readiness for the end. In the early hours of the 17th day of November, 1558, the Queen's breathing grew shallow. Her ladies knelt around her bed, clutching rosaries, whispering prayers. One of them, Jane Dormer, held her hand, and later swore she felt the Queen's lips move in the final moments. Those who were there said that Mary's last words were of God and Mother, the two figures who had never abandoned her, the two she had trusted more than any living soul. Her eyes opened once, as if seeing something no one else could see, and then slowly closed. Mary Tudor, Queen of England and Ireland, died just before dawn. Outside her window, London lay silent. The bells that had once rung for her coronation now tolled for her soul. Within hours, the council proclaimed Elizabeth Queen, and the long shadow of one reign gave way to the uncertain light of another. In her death chamber, the candles burned low. On the table beside her lay a crucifix, worn smooth by her fingers, and a portrait of Catherine of Aragon. Between them rested a folded parchment, her final prayer, written in a trembling hand, Domine, fiat voluntas tua, Lord, thy will be done. And with that, the story of England's first crowned queen ended not in triumph, but in faith, sorrow, and silence. The moment Queen Mary breathed her last, a long, heavy silence fell over St. James's Palace. Then, as if the air itself exhaled, a murmur rippled through the corridors. A single name passed from servant to noble, from noble to street. Elizabeth. By mid-morning on the 17th day of November in the year 1558, London was awake with whispers of renewal. Bells that had tolled for Mary's soul now rang in brighter tones, echoing across the grey sky as if to announce the dawn of a new age. People wept not for the dead queen, but for the promise of her successor. For the courtiers who had survived 5 years of fear and fire, Mary's death was a release. The tension that had haunted the realm, the endless prayers, the purges, the silence lifted with her final breath. It was as though the nation itself had been holding its lungs, and at last could breathe again. But for Mary, that last breath had carried something heavier, the collapse of a lifelong illusion. She had believed with the certainty of faith that her loyalty to God could heal her kingdom, that her suffering, her sacrifices, her prayers, and her flames would draw England back into grace. Yet as she died, the realm was not united but divided, the faith not restored but hollowed. She left no heir to continue her mission, no husband beside her, no child to inherit her name. The great vision of a renewed Catholic England died with her, extinguished like a candle guttering in a cold wind. In the days following her death, even her household seemed to fade away. Her ladies, those who had prayed beside her bed, packed their trunks and quietly departed. Her confessor said Mass for her soul, but the crowds who once lined the streets for her coronation stayed home. The streets of London, so often alight with her processions, were still. Far away in Brussels, her husband, King Philip II of Spain, received the news without ceremony. He wrote to his council that he felt a moderate sorrow, un sentimiente mediano. There were matters of empire to attend to, and the widow he left behind had long ceased to be of use. Within weeks, his letters carried another message, a proposal of marriage to Elizabeth. It was the final cruelty, the last cut to the heart of a woman who had loved too deeply and too alone. Even in death, the man for whom she had prayed and suffered sought not her memory, but her throne reborn in another. Mary's funeral was arranged with quiet efficiency. She had wished to be buried at Westminster Abbey beside her mother, Catherine of Aragon, the woman who had shaped her soul and taught her to endure. But the request was ignored. Political convenience outweighed sentiment. Instead, she was interred in the north aisle of Henry VII's chapel, beneath the marble floors of her father's dynasty. Years later, her grave would be opened again not to honour her, but to make room for her sister. The new queen, Elizabeth I, would be laid in the same vault, her coffin resting atop Mary's. The symbolism was bitter beyond words. For in life, Mary and Elizabeth had stood on opposite shores, faith and reform, past and future, and now, in death, they were bound together in stone. The inscription above their shared tomb did not speak of rivalry or sorrow. It spoke only of one queen, and it was not Mary. Upon the black marble slab that covers both sisters are carved these words: "Consorts in realm and tomb, here sleep Elizabeth and Mary, sisters, in hope of resurrection. Hell, yet only Elizabeth's image was ever cast in marble serene, crowned, her eyes open toward eternity. Mary's likeness was never carved. There is no effigy, no face, no hands folded in prayer. Only the flat black stone, unadorned, indifferent, sealing her name beneath her sister's shadow. Above ground, Elizabeth's reign began with brilliance. The court that had once been sombre now glittered with music, art, and speech. The new queen, quick-witted and unafraid, turned the realm toward prosperity and legend. In time, poets would call her Gloriana the morning star of a golden age. And Mary? History gave her a different name: Bloody Mary. It was a title coined not by her enemies in her lifetime, but by the voices that came after, by the chroniclers of reform, by the whispering pens of heretics turned heroes. It was a name that burned away all complexity, leaving only the smoke of her deeds. The faith that had sustained her became fanaticism. Her devotion became cruelty. Her sorrow became shame. In the centuries that followed, she was remembered not as a queen of conscience, but as a warning. Her name invoked not reverence, but fear, the cautionary tale of a woman who mistook zeal for grace. Yet within her own heart, Mary had never seen herself as a monster. She had believed she was England's last faithful daughter, the healer of its soul, the servant of its God. And perhaps, in the stillness of that November dawn, when her eyes closed for the final time, she believed she had succeeded. In truth, her death marked not the salvation she had sought, but its end. From that moment, the tide turned forever. England would never again bow to Rome. The fires she lit in the name of heaven became the embers that fueled a new, worldly power, the age of her sister, the age of empire. In the quiet of Westminster, beneath the cold marble and the shadow of Elizabeth's effigy, Mary Tudor lies still. No portrait watches over her, no prayer is spoken in her name. But somewhere, beneath the weight of centuries, her heart, the heart that once bore the word Calais, may still whisper its final plea: Lord, forgive them. They knew not what they did. Oh, and so ends the story of England's first crowned queen, the woman who loved her God, her husband, and her country, and who was, in the end, forsaken by all three. History, as it would unfold, would not be kind to Mary Tudor. In the centuries that followed her death, one image came to define her entirely: the fires of Smithfield, where hundreds of men and women were burned in the name of faith. Those flames, once meant to purify, became her eternal brand. To generations after, she was Bloody Mary, the queen of smoke and screams, the woman who turned England into a pyre. But behind that dreadful epithet was a soul torn between obedience and yearning, a heart that had been wounded too deeply, too young. From her earliest years, Mary had been taught that the Catholic faith was not merely belief, but structure, the divine order that held the world together. God above, King below, father before child. When her father defied Rome to cast aside her mother, she saw not only a husband betraying a wife, but a monarch rebelling against heaven. In that moment, the ground beneath her sense of right and wrong cracked forever. Every act of her later life, her defiance of Henry, her reluctant signature that damned her conscience, her crusade to restore Rome, even her order to burn grew from the same seed, the desperate need to make the world whole again. To Mary, faith and justice were one and the same. She did not burn heretics to punish them, but to heal a rupture she believed had cursed her nation. She thought she was saving souls, not destroying them. The tragedy was that her sense of mercy had been shaped in the fire of her own humiliation. In a world that called women fragile, Mary proved she was steel. She governed with the discipline of a soldier, the resolve of a martyr. She faced rebellions, famine, plague, and treachery without flinching. She rode out against armed insurrection when men advised retreat. She spoke before a hostile crowd at Guildhall and turned fear into loyalty with a single vow: I am your lawful queen. With this ring, I am married to my realm. Few kings of her century showed greater courage. Yet the same courage that would have been lauded in a man was deemed monstrous in her. When kings burned heretics, they were defenders of the faith. When a woman did it, she was unnatural. A queen who wept was weak. A queen who ruled without trembling was cruel. Mary had the misfortune to be both devout and female in a century that could not reconcile the two. The history that survived her was written not by her priests or her friends, but by her enemies, by the chroniclers of Elizabeth's court, by Protestant pens sharpened in exile. John Foxe's Book of Martyrs, printed in 1563, only 5 years after her death, sealed her fate. Its woodcuts of men burning at Smithfield, its verses of agony and faith, turned Mary from a woman into a warning. And when Elizabeth's reign blossomed into what poets would call the Golden Age, Mary became the shadow against which that brightness was measured. The sister who had burned became the foil for the sister who built. The queen who silenced voices of dissent became the prelude to an age of speech and song. Thus, in the mirror of history, Elizabeth's light demanded Mary's darkness. One could not shine without the other's ruin. Yet if one looks past the smoke, another image of Mary emerges quieter, more human. A daughter who never stopped mourning her mother. A woman who waited by the river for a husband who would not return. A ruler who prayed for her people, even as they cursed her name. Her story is not one of cruelty alone, but of faith carried to the edge of despair. She was both victim and author of her tragedy. A woman who sought divine justice, but lived in a world that only offered political vengeance. Perhaps this is why her tomb bears no glory. Beneath the black marble that seals her with Elizabeth, there are no sculpted angels, no crown carved in relief, only smooth stone dark, unmarked, unanswering. There is no word for innocent, and none for guilty. It is as if even the dead could not decide which she was. And perhaps that silence is the truest epitaph. For between those two extremes, between faith and fire, love and duty, sin and salvation, lies the space where Mary Tudor truly lived. Her story, stripped of myth and smoke, is not the tale of a monster, nor of a saint, but of a human being crushed beneath the weight of history and belief. The daughter who fought to restore her mother's honor, the queen who tried to heal her fractured nation, and the woman who, in doing so, lost herself. So when the visitors at Westminster pass over the black stone that hides her name, they tread upon more than a grave. They walk over the ashes of a question that has never been answered, the question of how far one should go for faith, and what is left of love when belief becomes law. Perhaps that is why her resting place remains so plain, so undecorated. The stone does not accuse, nor absolve. It simply waits like her soul, somewhere between mercy and fire. And maybe, if one listens closely in the hush of the abbey, beyond the echo of Elizabeth's triumph and the hum of centuries, one might still hear a whisper rising from beneath the marble. I burned for what I believed. Neither confession nor defense, only truth, quiet and unadorned, spoken by the woman the world named Bloody Mary, but who died believing she had been faithful. If one were to tell the story of Mary Tudor as a lullaby, it would begin with the sound of bells and end in silence. Between those two notes, one of joy, one of stillness, lies the life of a woman who carried both radiance and shadow within her. She was born beneath the ringing of church bells at Greenwich in the year 1516, when England rejoiced for the long-awaited child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, and she died, 42 years later, beneath the same chime of bells, though this time they tolled not for triumph, but for rest. Mary loved through faith, fought through faith, and perished in faith. Every act of her reign, whether judged righteous or cruel, flowed from a single conviction, that she was serving God. She believed that through devotion, discipline, and obedience, she could heal the wound that had split her nation in two. And yet, as the years turned, that very devotion hardened into something colder, a fortress built not of love, but of fear. For in the realm of absolute faith, there is little room left for mercy. It was not wickedness that consumed Mary, but certainty. She had seen her mother humiliated, her God defied, her own name stripped of legitimacy. In that crucible of betrayal, she learned to equate salvation with control, forgiveness with punishment. And so, when she lit the fires at Smithfield, she did so not as a tyrant drunk on blood, but as a believer desperate to burn away sin. To her, the crackle of flame was the sound of cleansing the nation purified through pain. But history has no sympathy for sincerity when it breeds suffering. The same fire that she saw as sacred, others saw as monstrous. Mary's tragedy was not only that she lost, but that she could never see herself as lost. To the end, she believed her cause divine. She never imagined she might be wrong. In that sense, Mary was both victim and architect of her fate, a queen swallowed whole by the faith that once sustained her. The same devotion that had made her strong also blinded her to the quiet humanity that flickered inside her. She was not evil, she was devoured, and when the Tudor night finally drew to its close, her shadow still trembled across the centuries, not as condemnation, but as a question. Is it possible to be utterly loyal to heaven, and still tender to earth? Can a heart that beats for God still make room for the fragile pulse of humankind? These are the questions Mary left behind, etched not in marble or scripture, but in the uneasy silence that follows her name. At Westminster Abbey, where she lies beside the sister who eclipsed her, the air remains cool and solemn. Tourists pass over the black slab without knowing whose bones rest beneath. They look up to the gilded effigy of Elizabeth the Gloriana of a golden age, and never see the woman beneath, the one who ruled before, whose hands once held the same sceptre, whose prayers once echoed through the same halls. Yet if one lingers long enough in that quiet, and listens, truly listens, a different sound emerges. Not the clang of power or the hiss of flame, but something softer, a breath, a murmur. Perhaps it is the whisper of a woman finally at peace with her own contradictions. I am Mary, daughter of Catherine. I did all that I could. It is not an apology. It is not a boast. It is simply truth. The truth of a soul who fought to the limits of her understanding, who tried to reconcile heaven and earth, and found herself lost between them. History remembers her as Bloody Mary, yet the quiet stones remember differently. They hold the weight of a mother's longing, a believer's desperation, a ruler's loneliness. They remember a queen who was both fierce and fragile, who stood alone against the tide of time. And in the trembling candlelight of history, her image still flickers, not monstrous, not saintly, but human. The bells that once rang for her birth have long been silenced. The flames that once burned for her cause have turned to ash. All that remains is the hush between the two, the lullaby of a queen who loved, who fought, who failed, and who is, at last, forgiven by time. So as the story fades, let the lights dim, let the air grow still. Imagine the faint glow of a single candle before it dies, its smoke curling gently upward like a final prayer. And in that soft breath of smoke, the voice of Mary Tudor drifts once more. Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit. A sad and beautiful ending, a cradle song of faith and fire, where history's candle trembles one last time, and we drift to sleep to the rhythm of a queen both loved and forgotten.